Hello and welcome to those who have just joined us. We're just going to start in a couple of minutes while we wait for more participants. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. We might have some more participants joining us today. So welcome to the live briefing on the 10-year anniversary of the 2011 Norway attacks, reflections on the past and contemporary right-wing extremism landscape. Today's live briefing is co-hosted by the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, CREX, or the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo, and PERIL, or the Polarization and Extremism Research Innovation Lab at American University in Washington, D.C. So before I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers, I first want to lay out some housekeeping rules. So I briefly want to introduce ICCT to those who are less familiar with our work. My name is Avian Leidig, and I'm a research fellow at ICCT in the Current and Emerging Threats program. ICCT is an independent think and do tank based in The Hague, working to provide research, evidence-based policy advice, and practical on-the-ground solutions on matters regarding counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, with a special focus on prevention and the rule of law. A couple of other housekeeping notes to keep this session running smoothly. There will be a short half-hour Q&A after the panelists have spoken. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to submit it at any time during the briefing using Zoom's Q&A feature. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, and we'll give the opportunity to a few questioners to pose their question live in the briefing. Please also note that a recording of the briefing will be made available to all registered participants on the ICCT YouTube channel. Finally, please help us improve future live briefings by completing the very short post-event survey, it's only 3 questions, that will pop up on your screen when you leave the briefing. So I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers. Our first speaker today is Jakob Ravendal, who is a postdoctoral fellow at CREX. Our second speaker for today is Brian Hughes, who is associate director at PERIL. And last but not least, our third speaker is Victoria Jordan, who is an analyst in security at RAND Europe. In terms of the structure for today's live briefing, we will essentially have a roundtable discussion where I ask each speaker a few questions for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll move on to a Q&A with the audience members. And so, without further ado, let's now start our conversation with Jakob. So, Jakob, given that this live briefing is to commemorate the anniversary of the 22nd of July 2011 attacks in Norway, can you give us a brief overview of that day and its impact on Norwegian society?
Sure. Hi, Evan. Hi, everyone. This is, of course, a big question. But When the attack happened, it was actually the general summer holidays in Norway, meaning that a lot of people were on vacation. And many people aren't aware of the fact that Breivik wasn't initially planning to attack on that day or even against those targets. But he had to change his plans because he was running out of funds. And that's why he just ended up attacking these two targets. He was initially planning to build 3 fertilizer bombs, not 2. But as I said, he was running out of funds. People were on holidays, and on that day, he had also been attempting throughout the day to distribute his manifesto, and he was experiencing technical difficulties. So he was very delayed. So the bomb that went off in the government quarter exploded at 15:25, which means that also the few people that had been working, many of those had left office. So the impact of this attack could have been even worse if he had succeeded in carrying it out earlier. I myself was on an airplane, so I didn't hear about the attack until I landed in Italy, arriving at my parents' house. And I think for me and for most other Norwegians, it was a complete shock, of course, a completely unreal experience. It's important to keep in mind that at that time, right-wing extremism wasn't really a topic in Norway. We didn't have any organized militias that were very active in the streets anymore, as we had in the 90s, and it wasn't something people was very aware of. And Norway is a very small country, so this attack impacted on a lot of people. Just to give an example, the house that I was in, I was there with 2 friends, and one of these friends knew one of the persons that got killed in the government quarter. Actually, 1 in every 4th Norwegian knows someone bereaved by the attack. And the reason for this is that the kids that were at Utøya, they came from all over the country. This was a summer camp attracting people from the whole country. So that is why the attack had such severe impact of all of Norwegian society. And of course, for those living in Oslo, the bomb hit the heart of Oslo. I think everyone felt that. I have grown up in Oslo. I also remember a feeling of wanting to go back to Oslo. It felt strange not being there. And it was also strange, of course, learning in time that the perpetrator grew up in the same part of town as I did, that we frequented many of the same places and so on. So the impact was huge, but this was the immediate impact. It was shock and complete sort of impossible to believe that this could happen. I think in the more long term, we could divide the sort of impact in 3, perhaps 4 phases. So the first phase was the sort of phase of unity. Norwegians united after this attack, and one very telling example of this is a quote by then party leader of the Norwegian Progress Party, which is the party commonly associated with the far right in Norway. And the day after the attacks, she said, quote unquote, all 25,000 Progress Party members are Labour Youth members today. So that was telling of the kind of atmosphere that was in Norway in those days. That was the initial phase. Then the second phase was perhaps more a phase of silence. People naturally moved on. And for, I guess, many people, that was a normal thing to do. But then for those who were bereaved, that was perhaps unbearable, seeing that society moved on. And that is something that really sort of exploded now with the 10-year anniversary, because now all the discussion came up and it became clear that those who were bereaved had experiences that were not necessarily all positive, feeling that their cause hadn't been heard, that there wasn't devoted sufficient attention to right-wing extremism after the attacks and so on. And so this has led to a somewhat more polarized situation now, with people on the left and the right disagreeing a little bit about how this narrative is to be understood. And I guess the really open question now is whether this polarization will continue, or if we will be able to reconcile. And I think there are some good signs after all the debates that we have had on this occasion that reconciliation might be within reach. I really hope so personally, because polarization is exactly what the terrorists wanted.
Great, thank you so much for laying out the events of that day, and also its short and long-term impacts, as well as how it personally affected you as well. I think, we often lose that when we're analyzing these types of events and the types of very human responses that arise out of it. And so you've touched upon this a bit, but I'd like to move on more broadly to what has been the legacy of the 2011 attacks on right-wing extremism more broadly, both within Norway and internationally.
Right. So one of the things that I've been doing in my work on this is tracking responses within the far right and all kinds of support that the perpetrator has received. And I recently, together with a colleague of mine, Lars-Erik Berntsen, we published an article. We have actually been doing this sort of in parallel, where I have been focusing on the more extreme elements of the movements, and he has been focusing on the more moderate but still radical right part of the movement. And so we published an article now basically summarizing this recording and archiving responses for a period of 10 years. And there are multiple findings from this research. The perhaps most striking and slightly surprising, perhaps to some, is that the overall reaction from the far right, at least the organized elements of the far right, has been complete rejection. And this has not only been, at least in particular in Western Europe, and of course, especially so within the more moderate wings, but also surprisingly, perhaps within the more extreme elements. So as an example, the editors of the white nationalist site Stormfront were very quick to state that they didn't want any hailing of Breivik on their site. And similarly, the National Socialist Norwegian or Nordic resistance movement very early on rejected this guy, the terrorist, and sort of depicted it as a Jewish ploy. So early on, there was the general reaction was complete rejection, but there were some exceptions to that. And of course, I guess it's also worth mentioning that in our piece, we discussed whether this rejection was sort of strategic because people understood that it's not really appropriate to support this kind of action, or whether it was real. My sensation is that for many, it was quite real because although these people subscribe to quite extreme rhetoric, they're still more or less part of the sort of Western socialized culture where violence is still a very strong taboo. And that's one of the arguments that we're making in this article, that the extreme violence here meant that a lot of people rejected him. But what we saw was that in Russia, there was a lot of support from Russian neo-Nazis initially. They were walking on the streets, hailing him without any sort of embarrassment. And also quite quickly after the attack happened, there was a sort of cult, an online cult that developed, partly consisting of people obsessing with mass murder, partly consisting of girls being romantically interested in the perpetrator as a form of hybristophilia, and then partly of people being sort of politically interested. And those were the ones who eventually started managing and ruling out this online cult, which existed for many years. It ended up being led by one single individual that became Breivik's spokesperson. He was, of course, anonymous until a Norwegian journalist managed to track him down. And after that, the whole support network collapsed. So that was the sort of the first wave of support that we saw. And then there was silence for some time. And then with the evolution of the chant cultures and the siege subcultures and so on, we saw a new second wave of support within these subcultures, especially on the chants and other message boards. And then, of course, it's very difficult to assess the severity of these support statements within this trolling culture, where shock is sort of the aim, and it's very difficult to assess the sincerity, but the amount of support statements in these fora are overwhelming and very, of course, concerning. So that is what we've seen in terms of support. And finally, I guess we also seen a slight movement within the white nationalist movement, white supremacists, that initially rejected him. Has more and more people have come to embrace him lately. So we sort of see this, we come back to this taboo framework and see that it appears that distance in time and space seems to mediate the level of support. So it appears that the more time passes and the more distant away people are, the easier it is to support them. So that is sort of a quick summary of findings from this research.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think we will circulate that article to all the participants after this event. I was also thinking, I guess, as a follow-up with this recent wave of white nationalist support for Breivik, have you considered that it's not just distance with time and space, but also how societies have changed in the past 10 years and how political conditions have changed, if you think that there's any external influences in that sense?
Well, I guess at least you can interpret some of these subcultures as sort of expressions of what's going on in other places in the world and reactions to that and so on. One thing though that we're noting is that while there are a lot of anonymous support statements, non-anonymous support statements are still very rare. So it's still quite at least full support, but some people are starting to say that, well, perhaps his ideas wasn't that bad, and some people are saying, well, I might not support the attack because it targeted white children, but if his targeting was different, you know. So we are seeing this slight sort of temporal movement, which is concerning. Yeah,
and it's quite differentiated as well. So that's really interesting. So now I sort of want to sort of dip into really the details of the work that you do. So in your opinion, has the modus operandi and tactics of Breivik changed the way we study right-wing terrorism and consequently counterterrorism responses?
So yes, I definitely think it has changed it. It's certainly changed the focus to much more research on lone actor terrorism. Before these attacks, a lot of the literature on extreme right violence was about group mechanism, group social interactions and subculture, but more sort of old school street subcultures like the neo-Nazi skinhead subculture and so on. And then there of course, was a wave of both good and bad research following in the wake of these attacks on lone actor terrorists. Right now, I think we're actually seeing a very interesting fusion of those two research traditions, where we're seeing a lot of subculture theories being brought back in, but now to understand online subcultures and how they affect the offline behavior of lone actor terrorists. So that's an interesting development. Research, sort of empirical research on lone actor terrorism has made tremendous steps forward, I think, during those 10 years. Some very important insights have been provided, especially by the work done by Paul Gill and his team. And, you know, a couple of very important aspects, I think, is both relating to the sort of signaling behavior that lone actors seem to display, that they often do signal their intentions before an attack to their immediate surroundings, which have, of course, very important implication for counterterrorism responses. But of course, also the mental profile of lone actors, finding that they, not only compared to the population, but also compared to organized terrorists, they have a much higher likelihood of suffering from some very specific types of mental disorders, which is also, of course, findings that have impact for counterterrorism practices.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard question because you have to sum up 10 years of research into a few minutes. But I think, yeah, we'll discuss more of that later on with the Q&A. And my final question to you then is, you have developed the RTV, or Right-Wing Terrorism and Violence data set at CUREX, which is updated each year to reflect new trends of right-wing terrorist attacks across Western Europe. Can you tell us more about this project, as well as why and how you're expanding it to include other countries within your data set?
Sure, I'm very happy to do that. So this, before the 22nd of July attacks, I was not working in this field. So I was also actually, it affected my life quite a lot by actually, I was asked to do a PhD on this topic, which is how I entered the field after the attacks. One of the things that I realized very early on is that we didn't have systematic data on this phenomena in Western Europe so that I could place this attack within a sort of a larger universe of events. So that's why I, for my PhD, a part of my PhD was building this first version of the data set, which documented severe and fatal attacks between 1990 and 2015. This was when I was working at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. So they sort of were behind the initial version. And then when CREX was founded and established, fortunately, there were interest in continuing this work. So since then, we've been able to recruit a team of research assistants that update the dataset annually. And really what it is an attempt to give us a systematic measurement of trends to understand whether it's on the increase or on the decrease, whether some countries are experiencing more of it than others and so on. Because if you look at the data that is out there, there's some very, very important measurement errors, and it's really challenging to collect systematic data on right-wing terrorism. And so this has been, I think, a very fruitful endeavor for Western Europe. And now we're realizing that, of course, as your own work has shown, Evian, that the extreme right is not exclusively a Western phenomena, and it's perhaps even more of a challenge elsewhere. So we are very eager to expand our data into new regions. So we're currently working on an expansion into Eastern Europe. We will release new data from that, hopefully in not too long. We're working to expand into other Western democracies that are outside Western Europe, like New Zealand and Canada and Australia. We're collaborating with partners in the United States, so we will do joint research on similar attack data with them. And I have my own dream of, in time, also expanding into Latin America, because that is a region that is often ignored within this field of research, but it has a lot of challenges relating to the extreme right and right-wing terrorism. So that would be very interesting to expand into Latin America as well. And I could practice my Spanish skills.
Most important. No, thanks very much for giving us more of an update on the RTV dataset. And for those who are interested in learning more about it, you're welcome to check it out on the CREX website. Just look up the RTV dataset. Thank you so much, Jakob, for really trying to condense all those really complicated questions into just 10 minutes. And I look forward to sort of discussing more of these themes and topics in the Q&A. So now we're going to move on to our second speaker, which is Brian Hughes. So Brian, sort of moving to the US context. So Jakob had mentioned that the 2011 attacks have had a positive reception by the American far right, more so than perhaps in Europe. How would you characterize the right-wing extremist landscape in the US today?
Like Jakob says, 10 years ago, the mainstream in the United States really gave very little thought to right-wing extremism as such. But I would say, obviously, that's changed. The far right in the United States today, I'd characterize it as broader and deeper and much more dense than it has been in a very, very long time, certainly since 2011, but probably since at least the mid-century, the civil rights era here in the United States. It's broader. It's broader in the sense that more and more people are holding views that could be fairly described as extremist or far right. You have increased support for anti-democratic and authoritarian far right policies. You have the integration of conspiracy culture into mainstream conservative spaces. There's a steep increase in white nationalist and conspiracy theory-based political campaigns here in the United States. There's legislated suppression of scholarship pertaining to racism. The list goes on. But it's also deeper. It's deeper in the sense that the hardcore, the Americans who took inspiration from Breivik's attacks have become more emboldened. From spring through the autumn, we see in the Pacific Northwest of the United States just a series of ongoing campaigns of violence by groups like Patriot Prayer or the Proud Boys, who ideologically espouse a very similar position to the kind of Western chauvinist perspective that can be read in Breivik's manifesto. Other smaller groups, ones that espouse explicitly terroristic tactics or lone actors, they're more committed to violence than ever. Lone actor violence is indeed a more serious problem. This is really where some of the most direct valorization of Breivik can be seen online with these lone actors and their supporters. And then, of course, we saw how the events of January 6th played out, where you had a mass terrorist attack on a federal institution, where the intent was to overturn a democratic election and to install a far-right regime. And then finally, I think that the far right in the United States is more dense in the sense that the lines between the extreme and the mainstream are blurrier than ever. In a strange way, Breivik was a precursor to this, in the way that he was trying to bring the counter-jihad blogosphere in line with a more militant approach to the issues of immigration, Islam, and the way those issues play out in Western Europe. Things are really quite bad here at the moment, for lack of a more optimistic way of putting it. I'd say that's about why.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps for our audience, and this is sort of a follow-up question to that, because there's a lot of discussion about anti-government extremism, and how would you position that compared to our understanding of the far right or right-wing extremism?
Oh, well, anti-government extremism in the United States has to be taken in the broader context of the United States as a settler colonial project, the role that government has had historically in propping up the privileges of certain classes of citizens, white for the most part, capital holding interests. So when we talk about anti-government extremism in the United States, it doesn't mean anti-government in the sense of purely anarchistic society in some sort of Ted Kaczynski, anarcho-primitivist kind of way. What they're really talking about is delegitimizing government, the role of government beyond propping up that class of capital holding predominantly white citizens. This really actually gets into some of the structural and institutional conditions that I think are producing this period of elevated risk from the far right here.
Great. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that definition, because it can be quite a slippery slope sometimes. And I think some of our viewers might be interested in understanding, what does the landscape actually look like today? So I know you're not an expert on anti-government extremism, but it's quite helpful to clarify that. So yeah, moving then towards looking at right-wing extremism in the US more broadly, in what ways is it a consequence of sociopolitical conditions, as you sort of hinted to? And does this affect our understanding of the drivers of radicalization?
I think it does. I think it should inform our understanding of the drivers. We talk about the individual and the social drivers of radicalization, things like aggrieved entitlement, and all the dynamics that go into the polarization that we're seeing and that Jakob mentioned. But then there are factors that underlie that. There are deeper, more intractable or difficult to change structural conditions, like the legal conditions, the economic, the technological, the environmental conditions that we're living under. So from a legal and a regulatory point of view, the United States is politically structured in a way that ensures disproportionate power to some of our most reactionary elements. And our constitutional order is set up in such a way that it is extremely difficult to change that basic political situation. The Senate, the Supreme Court, the Electoral College, these are institutions that have been set up to ensure from the days of the founding fathers, they've been set up to ensure that the United States does not become too democratic, that power is not distributed too democratically or too publicly. So in times of crisis like that, the way that our political institutions are structured really becomes a major driver of reactionary power and a real source of that reactionary power. And from an economic point of view, I mean, this is extremely complex, but the middle class security that white Americans came to take for granted for the past few generations has largely vanished. And in some ways, it was an historical aberration that was really purchased at the expense of minorities within this country and then in the third world as well. And we know that this sense of aggrieved entitlement is a major driver of radicalization. So people don't really have an understanding of why they can't depend on the comfortable suburban lifestyle that their parents and grandparents depended on. And there are myriad sources who are there to tell them that the reason they can't count on that security is because of immigrants, minorities, women in the workplace, the liberal elites on the coasts, you name it. This is also a kind of a driver of some of those senses of aggrieved entitlement that can lead to radicalization. Real quick, the internet and the technological infrastructure that we use to do politics so much in this country, it's played a critical role in uniting the far right and integrating it into the mainstream. It's easier to connect vulnerable individuals with extremist media and communities. We see in Breivik's manifesto the way he's pulling and cutting and pasting from all these different sources. Well, this was a person who was very deeply into the counter-jihad blogosphere at the time. Nowadays, it's easier for even a more casual reader, consumer of this kind of media, to be pulling things together and hopping from link to link in a way that coalesces into what amounts to an extremist ideological viewpoint. It makes it easier for organized groups to recruit, makes it easier for everyone to network. And then finally, there are the environmental conditions, climate change, war, mass migration. These are pushing populations both across borders and within national or state borders. And that is a major driver of conflict, precarity, scapegoating, all those risk factors that can lead to extremist radicalization.
Great, thanks, Brian. I sort of congratulate you as well for being able to boil that all down into really some very broad social conditions and themes, which offers a great holistic approach towards understanding this phenomenon in ways that often get overlooked. So I very much appreciate that. And then my final question to you then is, can you tell us about some of the work that you're doing at Peril with your team, and what are the focus of your projects? Who are the stakeholders that you interact with? I think the audience would just love to learn more about some of the work at Peril.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll introduce the work we do at Peril by saying that we tend to think of securitized solutions, so things like law enforcement, surveillance, and so on, as Band-Aid solutions. They're necessary, obviously, but they're really only able to address the problem after it's reached a crisis point, violence or the threat of imminent violence. So at Peril, we're doing our best to go a little deeper to the root of the problem, at least as close as we can get. And we do that with a commitment that precedes all of our work. Our work has to be non-carceral, more generally non-securitized. And our work always prioritizes the needs of targeted communities and victim survivors. Now we have a variety of projects that pursue these goals through different means, and I encourage everyone, to visit our website, american.edu/peril, to read about them if you're interested. But one very promising area where we've had some real success is in what's called attitudinal inoculation. And attitudinal inoculation is it's a form of preemptive counter messaging. Basically, what it entails is educating audiences about the manipulative, persuasive strategies that extremist propaganda uses to convert people or to recruit people to its cause. So attitudinal inoculation, it's not so concerned with the facts or the false facts of an issue. You don't get into the nitty-gritty of crime rates, who commits more crimes when and where or what. Instead, it really focuses on the narratives and the rhetoric that really create the emotional connection that people feel with this kind of propaganda. So, an example to tie it to Breivik would be the Eurabia conspiracy theory. An attitudinal inoculation message would introduce its audience to the conspiracy theory of Eurabia and present it as a conspiracy theory. It would warn the audience that this is a conspiracy theory that has fooled otherwise intelligent, even moral people. It can be quite compelling because it's quite manipulative. And we would show them some of the key points of the Eurabia conspiracy theory, and we say, if you see topics like these being brought up, then pay close attention. There's a good chance that a person is trying to manipulate you into believing something that isn't true, that isn't in your best interests, and that increases the likelihood that you or someone around you might commit an act of violence. And there's actually decades of good research showing that attitudinal inoculation can be effective. There are shortcomings. It really only works on people who do not have strong opinions on the topic. This is sort of to reach the uncommitted or the agnostic. So it's not a de-radicalization tool. It really has to be part of a broader toolkit. But what I think it can do is it can buy us time. It was so wonderful to hear that reconciliation is a possibility, between polarized political factions in Norway. That's not an option in the United States at the present moment. It's painful to say, but what something like attitudinal inoculation can do is it can buy us time. It can stem the flow of vulnerable individuals entering radicalization pathways so that we have more time and less opposition and less violence to distract us from addressing those deeper structural issues that we discussed just a second ago from this increasingly mainstream far right.
Thanks so much, Brian. I guess just to follow up on that, can you talk about some of the stakeholders that you do work with most on projects like attitudinal inoculation?
Yes, I can. Attitudinal inoculation has primarily been a joint effort with Peril and Jigsaw. Jigsaw is the nonprofit wing of Google. They are actually partnering with a variety of academic labs, institutions, research centers who are working on similar issues. Partly because they're discovering more and more that content moderation is incredibly difficult to scale. Something like fact checking, it does work, but it doesn't really scale, and it tends to work the least well on the people who most need it. So we're looking for ways to inoculate people, in essence, to vaccinate them against extremist propaganda, not to tell them what to think, but to give them the tools to recognize when someone else might be trying to manipulate them.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, it's interesting use of metaphors there with the vaccination, inoculation, building up immunity, I would venture to say. thanks so much for giving us an overview of the American context, as well as some of the work you're doing at Peril. And I'm sure we'll have much more to discuss in the Q&A. So thank you for that. And before I turn now to Victoria, just a reminder to the participants that you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A function, and that we'll get to those questions once we're done going through with all the speakers in the Q&A. So yeah, so moving on now to Victoria. There we are, there I can see you. So yeah, now we're moving more towards policy-oriented work, moving from academic to policy-oriented work. Can you start off by telling us about some of the research that you have been doing with RAN, as well as other projects on right-wing extremism?
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question, Vivian. So to put a little bit of context into what the RAN is doing and who we are, so basically RAN Europe is part of a consortium which is delivering the policy makers and researchers a lot of the RAN, which is the Radicalization Awareness Network. This network brings together practitioners, law enforcement, national administrations together in their efforts to tackle radicalization for the past 10 years. And since last year, the policymakers and researchers lot part of it aims to provide policymakers with the most up-to-date knowledge base stemming from ongoing research and access also to a network of research organizations and experts. So that includes RAN Europe as well as ICCT, which is how we connected. But it's worth noting that at RAN Europe, we also conduct research on extremism, including right-wing extremism in different contexts. So that includes other individual research projects for the European Commission, as well as other government bodies like the UK Home Office, for instance. But so within this context, in recent months, we've produced a few studies on PCV, and specifically the growing threat posed by right-wing extremism has translated into increased attention to this topic from the sphere of policymaking. And among studies we've conducted, it has featured extensively both in general studies on countering different types of terrorist attacks, but also on studies regarding the nexus between hateful speech, disinformation, and hateful extremism during the COVID pandemic. So we're looking at this from a few various angles. And most recently, we've investigated mechanisms and strategies that are used by right-wing extremist groups online to connect with each other. So within Europe, as well as between Europe and the US. And so yeah, some interesting findings from this research include specifically the challenges in mapping the online ecosystem of right-wing extremism, because this is changing incredibly rapidly. And this consists of complex networks of individuals, groups, and movements that are loose and flexible, and therefore allow for ample interaction and cross-fertilization of narratives, but cannot always be specifically defined into specific entities. But we do see that, yeah, there is a cross-fertilization of narratives like the Great Replacement Theory, for instance, between European and American actors. And we found that those transnational links tend to focus specifically on inspiration rather than operation or organization. And so as Brian just mentioned, manipulation strategies online, for instance, are very relevant in this context. And we did find there's emerging evidence towards increasingly coordinated efforts to mainstream right-wing ideologies online internationally. I won't go specifically into the tools that are used, but it's worth mentioning that we're releasing online a variety of tools, from podcasts to encrypted channels, as well as more recently video streaming platforms that make use of monetization systems through cryptocurrencies for funding. So there's really a host of various tools that I use for different purposes, from harassment, intimidation, recruitment to funding. Yeah, so I'll stop here, but I'll just say a few words on the implication that stem from this type of research, where we find that, for instance, there is obviously a pressing need for further investment in capacity building within law enforcement, intelligence, and analysis to focus on monitoring online as well as offline evolutions of right-wing extremism, but that this becomes fully integrated within efforts to monitor other kinds of extremism and terrorism. And of course, improving digital and critical literacy knowledge and skills among children and youth, but also vulnerable groups who tend to be, again, as Brian was just mentioning, the easy target of misinformation campaigns and other influence operations. Other implications relate to strategic communications efforts that need to be developed to target violent right-wing extremism online, as well as investing the effectiveness of existing and proposed mechanism to counter those narratives online. I'll stop here to not give away all the research that we're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And it sounds like it's such a vast online ecosystem that you're trying to map as well, which is quite a task, but very timely and necessary work, of course. And so my next question for you then is, given all this research that you've been doing, what are the challenges in defining right-wing extremism when translating that academic research for policymakers and practitioners? And do you think that this challenge is specific to the EU context?
Great. So thanks for this question. I think it's first worth mentioning that the challenges in defining right-wing extremism are manifold already in academic research. So this is not only specific to our work in translating it for policymakers and practitioners, especially as we already touched upon, the ideologies delineating it are particularly difficult to map out and specifically understand which traits come into play. And so we find that commonly accepted traits defining right-wing extremism tend to be nationalism, racism, xenophobia, anti-democracy, authoritarianism, and populism. Yet today, far-right extremism is also characterized by opportunism and cooperation, where we see groups and actors that are overcoming ideological and geographical divergences to collaborate and expand their influence. That's been seen in the context of COVID-19 related conspiracy theories, for instance, but also in various other narratives. So this adds on to the difficulties with defining what right-wing extremism is really. And a key challenge when translating this research for policymakers and practitioners is to actually capture those definitional nuances and differences that already exist, while at the same time proposing a working concept that can actually inform future decisions and practical recommendations. To answer your question, whether this is specific to the EU context, I think something that is definitely specific to that context is that we have within the EU, and when working at EU level, specific challenges that are linked to the different understanding and cultural tradition of each member state making up the EU. And those inform the way right-wing extremism is understood, but also the way cultural attitudes towards each potential ideology underpinning it interact with that, and that also informs how measures can be developed. And different countries with different history and cultural tradition may have very, very different reserves and ideas about what can be done or not, which I mean is already a difference we see strikingly between the US and European countries, but that also exists within the EU. And I think another thing to note is that due to this sort of cooperation, collaboration, and online cross-fertilization that I was mentioning earlier, we're seeing that groups and actors are increasingly taking advantage of this difficulty in delineating them and which ideology they represent or adhere to. And so the right-wing extremism landscape includes those loser groups and networks, as well as far-right actors, associations, and violent movements as well. And within this, some of those actors may be able to take advantage of more accepted narratives, or perhaps far-right actors that are involved in the political landscape, which makes again the delineation between those actors not easy to identify, and the tactics that are built around this make actually use of these definitional challenges in threading the line between what can be easily understood as right-wing extremism and some different borderline fringe behaviors and content, which can more difficultly be pinpointed as extremist, and therefore it's harder to develop specific measures against.
Thank you for breaking down what's really quite complex relationships and processes at play. But that challenge exists, I suppose, for people like yourself in order to help disentangle that and think about some broad and some reaching implications of this research in your work. And something I was curious about is, given that you are an analyst in security more broadly, not just right-wing extremism, how would you say right-wing extremism is different from other topics that you work on for policy analysis and recommendation?
Sure, yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking this. I think this question around definitional challenges that we were just discussing makes it particularly challenging, but also interesting to develop targeted recommendations, as do existing research gaps in radicalization and PCVE in general. But yet, in a way, the topic of right-wing extremism overlaps actually quite a lot with other security topics that we investigate, and therefore it links back into much of our work at RAND Europe on security threats, but also on social affairs. And of course, that includes threats linked to terrorism, but also our ongoing work on disinformation, emerging technologies, as well as future social trends. So in terms of translating this research into policy analysis and recommendations, there are actually very interesting opportunities for integration and cooperation between other areas of policymaking. So that includes, of course, the recommendations we make towards the development of specific security measures, but also in the field of research and development, as well as education and social investment in general.
Yes, and this sort of alludes to what Brian was discussing earlier about the holistic dimension of right-wing extremism, right? And understanding how it operates in different spaces and avenues. And so how policies do need to be integrated in order to encompass what's quite a comprehensive threat. And so my final question to you then is, should we then adopt new frameworks of P/CVE and CT to fit this rather diffuse and fragmented contemporary threat of right-wing extremism?
Yeah, so again, that's an interesting question. And I think so this depends on which kind of frameworks we're referring to, and again going back to this holistic vision of the phenomenon as we're just discussing. In a sense, already much of the work around radicalization that's been conducted in the last decade has focused on developing tools and frameworks that are actually agnostic to the ideologies behind actors that are vulnerable or involved in extremist activities. So perhaps we should reflect more broadly on whether we're applying these frameworks and approaches equally to also account for right-wing extremism. And a key element in this sense is the need for existing framework to understand and account for strategies that are used both online and offline, and to develop measures to address particularly online radicalization. Again, that's not specific to right-wing extremism. That's online radicalization is not a new phenomenon by now, and we've seen this in other kind of extremism, but we're seeing that extreme right-wing actors have been particularly efficient at adopting communication technologies and at adapting to existing countermeasures. So perhaps it's not really about coming up with new frameworks, but rather ensuring that when applied, those frameworks and approaches that we know provide also a requirement and resources to look at right-wing extremist material. that answers your question.
Yes, no, it does. Thanks very much for that. It certainly gives some food for thought because of, I think, so much complexity around right-wing extremism and how different stakeholders approach it. Definitely has consequences for how we construct broader models and frameworks around this threat. So thank you very much for that. Now, I invite all the speakers onto the stage, for lack of a better phrase. And now we can turn on to the Q&A. So I don't see any questions from the panelists yet. I do hope that they'll come flowing in pretty soon. So I suppose at this stage, I can perhaps take advantage of my moderator function and think about some of the ways in which each of you perhaps have some shared commonalities in the research that you do. It's quite a lot to digest, actually, in terms of, I think all of you were very effective at condensing quite complex topics into 10 minutes or so. So I appreciate that. I guess, maybe to start off our discussion, which is, what do you think, and anyone is welcome to answer this, but what do you think is perhaps the most misunderstood when it comes to right-wing extremism today, whether that's from policymakers, practitioners, even the media or the public, in terms of how people understand this phenomenon? And this is quite an open question, so anyone is welcome to step in. And maybe this is also determined by different national domestic contexts as well. So,
well, maybe I'll just get the conversation started by sharing the US context. I think one of the most misunderstood facets of understanding far-right extremism in the United States is our inability to, or how rarely we appreciate the way that it has been woven into our history, that the history of slavery, white supremacy, and colonialism in this country is really part and parcel with the history of right-wing extremism itself, and how the far right today is in so many ways just a logical progression from some of those precedents that were set centuries ago, and in some ways just an attempt to return, sort of a rearguard action to try to recapture some of the modes of governance in our country that were terroristic and oppressive to begin with.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That's a very fair point. Jakob, I think maybe you disagree, maybe you agree. I'm curious to know your response to this.
Well, I'm not going to argue with Brian on the American context. He's definitely the expert on that, and I'm really not. But well, first of all, thank you for a great question. I'm happy you asked that. And I do think there are some important misunderstanding or misconceptions that I come across every now and then. And I guess before listing them, it's important to note that where I sort of come from the terrorism research field. So my main concern and my colleagues has been sort of explaining terrorism, violence, understanding the key drivers of violence and not other forms of extremism. And I guess that shapes also the misperceptions that I see sometimes. So the most notable one for sure is the assumption that right-wing violence is on the rise everywhere, which is, I mean, what some of the data that we've been working hard on for many years to systematically track this, and it's just not the case, at least not for the most severe forms of violence, that it is on the rise in most countries. In fact, if you take a look at a more long-term perspective, like from the 1980s until today, it's been declining steadily in most countries. We tend to forget history sometimes. We tend to forget how violent the 90s were, for instance. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. But having said that, one trend that sort of probably fuels this notion of a rising threat is the fact that although we are seeing less fatal attacks, some of the attacks that we are seeing are very fatal. They have many fatalities, and in that sense, they gain a lot of public attention. So that is one thing. The other misconception, and this is perhaps an even more controversial one, but it relates to the relationship between far-right or radical right parties and violence, which is also something we've been looking into quite systematically, trying to track the correlation between these two aspects. And surprisingly, it's a general negative association. So in general, where parties have been strong over time or gaining a lot of electoral support, violence has been lower. I would be very careful assuming that is a causal relationship, because I think there are many other elements into play here. And in general, for instance, the 1990s were more violent, not just within the far right, but all other forms of violence. And fringe parties were not, not as successful. So there might be some different drivers here, but at least one should be careful concluding that support to far-right parties necessarily lead to violence, because that has just not been the case, at least not in the European context. I think another thing which is probably a sort of, I don't know if it's a misconception, but something we tend to forget sometimes, is that we tend to see sometimes far-right sentiments as something sort of unnatural, or something that is by default, morally wrong. And I guess, well, many people would support that, but it's also, important social psychological research is finding that people with authoritarian inclinations, they do make up about 1/3 of most societies, no matter where in history you go, no matter what kind of culture you go to. And I think this 1/3 to 1/4 of societies that have authoritarian inclinations, there's a strong overlap with those who are drawn into far-right politics. And I think it's having an ideal that this third of most societies can sort of be removed is probably not very realistic. So the question really is how to deal with people with authoritarian inclination, people who don't like change, people who don't like modernization, people who don't like what they regard as misfits to society and so on. How should we deal with that in a way that don't worsen their sentiments? And this is really, really challenging. I don't have the solution to that, but this notion that this is something that's probably going to be with us forever, it's not something we can eradicate. So the question is really how to address it in a way that is sort of perhaps the least worst scenario. And then finally, perhaps, the internet is becoming increasingly salient as a very important part of this field. And there's some really fascinating research going on in many countries now regarding internet and radicalization and so on. And I still think it's important to, I think in the internet has, like Brian talked about, has had huge implications for how easy it is to recruit and so on. But still, I think we should be careful concluding about the causal effect of internet on radicalization per se. I think it's sometimes perhaps better understood as a booster of radicalization, something that sort of fuels processes, but it's not the internet who's the sort of de-radicalizing factor, just as it's not newspapers or books per se, but more the content. And there's some confusion there sometimes, I think, when listening to people thinking about internet radicalization. So that was my list.
Yeah, I can see it's you've clearly thought about some of these issues for a while. So thanks for sharing what you think are some common misconceptions. I guess, in some ways I can test some of those points myself, particularly when we think about the role of online radicalization. And I agree with you in the sense that, we certainly have offline or socio-political economic factors that do help facilitate those narratives. Of course we do, but I guess I'm more on the side of thinking about how the infrastructures of these platforms themselves at least do help create those opportunities for narrative spreading, for radicalization, recruitment, propaganda sharing. I'm curious to know what Victoria might think about this, since you have been doing research on this for RAN.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like I've been nodding a lot in the past 5 minutes, as a lot of what Jakob said just resonates strongly with our research. And especially what you were just saying about understanding the internet as a cause of extremism or of radicalization, which is, I think, somewhat easy to take approach in the way that we see an increasingly vibrant discourse online, and perhaps that's also why there is a wrong perception that violent right-wing extremism is on the rise, and that is actually only or perhaps mostly linked to the growth of this vibrant online discourse that gives the wrong perception of a growth of right-wing extremism. But in fact, most of our research point to the fact that extremists are very able and capable in adapting to the infrastructure, and especially they've been able to make great use of online infrastructure, whether that's recommendation algorithm, encryption of channels, as I was mentioning, new ways of leveraging cryptocurrencies through streaming platforms and this kind of existing mechanisms online, but those are indeed mainly used to boost their tactics and as mechanisms to rely on. But what really is often the conclusion of a lot of our research studies is that there is also a need that has been there for a very long time, and that is really to address the root causes of radicalization. And those, in fact, are often to be found offline in the environment of vulnerable groups. So I think, yeah, this is something that we're really seeing in our research as well. But I think another point that I would like to add, also based on how extremists are able to make use of online infrastructure, is perhaps that something that we are increasingly seeing, but perhaps not yet ready to admit fully, is the actual the existence of defined strategies toward mainstreaming right-wing extremism, and that they are in fact coordinated influence campaigns online. And this is something that does exist. It is not the same as violent right-wing extremism, but it is something that also needs to be addressed and looked into.
Go ahead, Ryan. Yeah.
Can I jump in? Because, I think there's a very important point to be drawn out here about the violence of terrorist acts as such, and then the more ambient violence of having vocal, visible, and highly present extremist movements. This is why it's important to really always be keeping in mind the actual people who are potentially targeted by this. Merely walking around in a society where you know that on your hip you have a device that can instantly connect you to thousands of people who will tell you all the horrible ways they want to kill you. That is living in a condition of violence, living with the threat of violence pervasive anytime you use the most basic media infrastructure available to us. The internet, something that's required to have a job and have a career in this world. That's a living with the threat of violence, and that can have psychological, which can have physiological consequences. I mean, this has been demonstrated that the stress that goes along with living under the threat of violence has physiological consequences. It has mental health consequences, and it can shorten lifespans. So violence isn't just the bombs going off and the guns going off. Violence is also ambient. And again, I mean, not to hammer this point home like an obnoxious academic, but structural. It's the water we swim in as much as it is the horrific and highly visible events. Again, like those committed by Breivik.
If I could just build on to what Brian's saying here, because I think it's a very important point, and I actually think it sort of taps into and also shows quite clearly how scholars coming from different traditions focus on different aspects. So of course, when you do, as Brian, you take the victim's perspectives, you're looking at things very differently. But I think sometimes there are some interrelationships as well. Clearly, this is a very, very unfortunate situation for those who are experiencing this sort of structural form of violence. And that is also why I think it is important that misconceptions about actual violence are not, exaggerated. That we do, make people aware that in fact there are less attacks now than there were before. And so in order not to, make this sensation about being under threat worse than it actually might be. So that's one point. And the other point about the internet, of course, is that although, we don't have data on the number or the share of the population that supports an extremist viewpoint. And whether that has increased or decreased over time, that's an open question. It would be interesting to see. What we know for sure is that the amount of extremist material that is available to anyone and that is produced on a daily basis is so big now that that's historically something that we have never seen before. So that is, I think, the major change with the internet, that the massive amount of propaganda that is produced daily and that is available to most people. And I guess against that backdrop, it's also sort of an interesting question, why not more people become radicalized considering all this? So it's important also to keep in mind some of the optimistic viewpoints, but I definitely appreciate the victim's perspective, and certainly I think it's important both to raise that, but also many people would say that following the 9/11 attacks, that danger was exaggerated, and that led to a lot of unnecessary fears and also some quite lethal counter-terrorist responses. So one should be very careful about how these different type of threats are portrayed, and of course then be specific about the kinds of violence we're talking about, be it structural violence, physical violence, and also the fact that the research we are doing is on the most severe types of violent attacks. Less severe violence might have different trends, and it's not because we don't consider it as relevant, it's just because the amount of it is so big that is impossible to track systematically. That is why we're focusing on the most severe violence. And a huge task for future research is to better understand the relationship between severe or fatal violence and less severe, whether that's a correlation or whether something different. I suspect that these are slightly different phenomena produced by slightly different conditions. And probably the less severe violence is, of course, much more extensive and being felt on an everyday basis by much larger target groups than this very severe terrorist type of violence that we are tracking, because it's the only one we can generate systematic data on as of today.
Yeah, thanks for making that distinction, Jakob, because I think that's quite important. And once you start to expand the RTV data set to other regions and countries, I am very curious to know what effect that's going to have on the data set overall. And also if the criteria that you have developed for systematic data collection on severe fatal events can actually then be equally applied within, say, the US or Latin America or other countries that you want to look at for the expansion of your data set as well. I'd be curious to know if you end up changing or altering your criteria for the data set because of that. So we have a few questions here already from participants. A really interesting question here that says, it seems to me there is a risk that too many types of people and groups are defined under right-wing extremism. Do you see a risk that many so-called right-wing extremists are pushed into becoming terrorists? So maybe this is a definitional issue, especially because violent extremism and terrorism is mixed. Does anyone want to take this question?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so the question is, there seems to be a risk that too many types of people and groups are defined under right-wing extremism. Do you see a risk that many right-wing extremists are pushed into becoming terrorists? So it seems like this question is trying to figure out the differences between violent extremism and terrorism and how we tend to label people under these categories.
I mean, it's an interesting question. There's something that's, it's possible to speculate about this. I mean, having read many autobiographies from violent extremists, they often claim that being constantly labeled this or that, sort of intensify the radicalization experience. Whether that is true or not, it would need more systematic research. But of course, I think labeling does matter. There's a pretty vibrant research tradition on what's known as soft repression. Basically, an example of soft repression will be the governments defining some kind of group as extremist, for instance. Most of the research that exists to date on soft repression is not about the far right, it's about the far left and about environmentalists and about LGBTQ plus activists and so on. But they are finding some interesting findings when it comes to this precise effect of that soft repression can sometimes have a radicalizing effect, but it's of course very, very context specific and so on. And this whole literature about repression and labeling and radicalization is very interesting, but it's also very, very tricky to measure empirically. But clearly, yeah, labeling can have unfortunate effects, but also labeling can be very important. Not to speak up from the victim's perspective, that those who are harassing them are actually, framed as what they are. So this is a delicate issue, and I'm happy that I'm not Victoria that has to recommend policies on this, because it's very, very hard. Hopefully I'll be contributing with some empirical research on it in the future. We'll see.
Yeah, I was actually going to move to Victoria to ask if you had any thoughts about this working with policymakers and practitioners.
Yeah, I think this is as Jakob was saying, this is a particularly good question also in the sense that it is a very challenging question, one that we do encounter every day, but don't really have a specific answer to, especially with regard to effects of labeling. As Jakob was mentioning, I'm aware that this is a research area, but we're not, this is not something we've looked into specifically. However, I think one thing that we do encounter in our research regularly is trying to understand the difference between violent extremism and terrorism and whether there is one or not. And that is something that is also understood differently depending on the context. Something I'd be very keen to hear Brian on is how this is understood in the US, because my understanding is that violent extremism in the US does not really have the same close to terrorism meaning that it does in Europe. Please do correct me if I'm going in the wrong direction here, but this is what discussion with some experts in the US have at least showed in some of our research. And again, this is something that we also see when looking at the type of research that I was mentioning earlier, especially with regard online mechanism to connect between right-wing extreme groups. It's not even just violent extremism and extremism. We also found that it's very difficult to put a limit here in terms of the interaction that we're looking at between established far-right groups, extremist groups, and violent extremists. And while violent extremists tend to have defined structures offline with very specific hierarchy, groups, names, and very specific ways of entering the group and being part of it. That's not the case for what we're seeing online. And with regard to whether this has an impact in terms of actions of the individuals, really all I can share is my best guess, which is that at least what we're seeing with regards actions and discussions from right-wing extremists online, there is generally a sort of mocking reaction in terms of the countermeasure and the academic and policy-making discourse around it, rather than much in terms of how it leads to violent action. But yeah, please, Brian, do correct if anything that I said about the difference between American and European perceptions of this is you see that differently.
And I would also add here, sorry, Brian, but just thinking about the fact that you mentioned that 10 years ago, right-wing extremism was not considered to be a very serious issue on the policy landscape either. And now we've seen most recently the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, which does include, I guess, REMV as the terminology that's used. I mean, yeah, basically I add this in because I'm really quite curious to see, how these types of labeling or categorizing has an effect in the US context as opposed to within Europe.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and actually it also points at the issue that Jakob brought up earlier about the response to 9/11 and the creation of what are sometimes called suspect communities, where law-abiding citizens, because of whatever features religious, cultural, or ethnic that they share with a perceived terrorist threat, themselves kind of become the targets of the kind of securitized approach to dealing with extremism and terrorism. We're at an inflection point in the United States. We don't have domestic terrorism designations the way that we do foreign terrorist group designations. There are terrorist acts, but there aren't terrorist groups, domestic. Obviously, we do designate foreign terrorist groups, and that won't change. I mean, again, the underlying law of the land, the First Amendment, just wouldn't permit for it. It's too sticky and problematic to really get out of the gate. I guess I'll say this, that I think that there is a risk of producing suspect communities in conservative or right-wing enclaves. I mean, I think you can very easily foresee how ultra-conservative Christians might view themselves as targeted as part of some, REMV suspect community. And that is something to be concerned about, simply because they have religious convictions outside the mainstream is no reason to cast aspersions on them in a way that views them as terrorists in waiting. And actually, to speak to this question maybe a little more directly, I'm kind of circling it here, but there is some indication that when you approach a person who you're concerned might be at risk for being radicalized, when you approach them in a way that says, look, there's a good chance that you're going to become a terrorist, so we want to stop you from doing that, people don't respond well to that. That does have a potential backfire effect. And again, to get back a little bit to some of the work we're doing at Peril, this is one of the reasons why attitudinal inoculation has proven relatively effective in the limited instances that we've been able to roll it out, because it assumes a good faith audience. It assumes that the audience is intelligent and moral and not on the cusp of committing some horrible act of violence. It says that actually good moral people can be intelligent, moral people can be led into doing bad things. So, it's complicated, and there's, I guess we don't know yet. We're in kind of an unprecedented moment here in the United States, and for better and for worse, the history of it has yet to be written.
Thanks, Brian. So we actually did have a question here concerning prevention. And you sort of did touch upon this, Brian, when you were talking about attitudinal inoculation, but this question is more geared not towards the general audience, but actually at-risk individuals who could potentially carry out attacks. And so this question is asking more about those individuals and what can change that decision whether or not to actually carry out an attack. Jakob, have you actually come across this when you were putting together the RTB data set in terms of motivations for individuals, or perhaps those who might have actually committed a terrorist attack but didn't and changed their mind?
I mean, that's the kind of information that is difficult. These are difficult cases to find because they're sort of non-cases. So we do code for plots, which are people who have been preparing for an attack, but the reason that the attack is foiled is typically not because they change their mind, but because the police discover what they're onto. But that would be a really interesting project to pursue. I think that would be. I can't say that I actually seen systematic research on that. It should be possible to sort of identify people who've been going down a path but then change their mind themselves. I know there's some research being done at the ICCT by Bart Schurman that's looking at trying to understand these kind of paths and why some extremists don't turn to violence. And there's some work also done with the Prius data set in the United States, looking at extremists that's compared violent individuals to non-violent ones. So, but exactly what makes someone change their mind, I think I don't have a good answer to that. Probably Brian has more insight into that than I have.
Well, as you say, the abandoned plots are incredibly hard, if not, methodologically impossible to really look at in a systematic way. What we do have is a lot of anecdata from people who are involved in violent extremist movements, not terrorist plots per se, but people who would commit street violence, and the conditions that led them to abandon those movements. There's a pretty broad literature of personal accounts, sort of autoethnographies and ethnographies of that sort of thing. And unfortunately, what we know is that it's idiosyncratic. That it often has to do with major life changes, something like moving to a new city, losing a family member, having a child, having some kind of a major falling out with people within the movement. That just opens up this little window of opportunity that some people choose to take advantage of and leave behind extremist politics. And also, there's a whole variety of ways of leaving behind extremist politics. We're the people who, so-called formers, who were extremists and are now either activists or involved in de-radicalization efforts are very visible. But there's reason to believe the majority of people who walk away from extremist movements either become apolitical or they continue to hold what we might think of as fringe political beliefs, but they're just out of the violent extremist fringe. It's an area where there's a lot of room for work to be done, necessary work to be done.
Absolutely. I think that's a good note to end on, since it's a rather optimistic one. So I would just like to thank all of our speakers today, Jakob, Brian, and Victoria, for joining me on this conversation. I feel like we could have actually continued on forever to talk about some of these issues, but I really appreciate you taking the time today to join us, and also to the participants who joined and engaged by asking questions, as well as those who are watching on YouTube now. Thank you very much for joining. And yeah, please do keep an eye out on ICCT's website. We will upload this webinar recording as well as onto our YouTube channel. And please do check out the work being done on CREX and Peril's websites as well, where you can find more information about the RTV dataset, as well as some of the projects occurring at Peril, as well as Victoria's work going on at RAND Europe. I'm sure that there'll be some publications released relatively soon about some of the research that you've been doing. So thank you to everyone who's joined us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks very much, Vivian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, guys.